Hey, Marcus Hutzel here, and in this video, I'm going to show you how to take apart the Atomos Shogun 7 because I needed to do just that, and I couldn't find any other videos on exactly how to take this thing apart and look inside. Recently, I had to send this thing off a couple of times directly to Atomos to have it calibrated. More info on that later, or look for a couple of other videos in my library. Nothing majorly was wrong with it, just needed some color calibration, and they were able to do that mostly for me. But anyway, the last time I got it back, the audio inputs didn't quite work. And I'm talking about specifically the audio inputs that you would use here on the small analog input on the side, for which you have to have the very expensive custom cable. Now, this is not the Atomos version of that cable. This is a third party I got on eBay, I think. Still cost me around 70 bucks, and it is the audio in only version. So I think one of the reasons it's so expensive is because it has this very small LEMO connector, and there's some very small soldering points in there. So, you know, with good labor comes great prices. So this cable obviously goes in the side, and you can put either two line level inputs, or you can connect a microphone directly to one of those cables and just use a microphone directly into it. But when I got it back last time, the left input just didn't work. And I was wondering, well, did it work when I sent it off to be repaired? And as far as I remembered, it did. So I wanted to pop this open to see if it was something simple. I didn't really want to have to send it back to Atomos a third time. I thought maybe if I could just open it up, maybe there's something simple inside. Maybe a ribbon cable came loose or something just didn't get connected. And luckily or unluckily, that actually happened to be the case. And I'll show you what happened in a minute, but first let's take this thing apart. So to do that, you're going to need to turn the unit over so you can see the back, and you're going to need to remove about 8 screws. You're going to remove the 2 in the top corners, the 2 in the bottom corners. You're going to remove the 2 on the bottom that are closest to the SDI inputs, and you're going to remove the corresponding 2 on the top that are also closest to the back of the unit. You don't need to remove the other 2 there. So the corner ones are very small and very recessed. So I use a very thin, small Phillips head screwdriver, and you can see here that they are quite recessed in there. So you're going to need something that can reach deep in there. We'll take those out. Just kind of dump those out. You've got your 4 screws there. Put those aside. Then I used a slightly larger but still small Phillips head screwdriver to remove the 2 screws here. All right, so that's the easy part. 8 screws doesn't seem like a big deal, but I couldn't actually get the back to come off at that point. I couldn't figure out what else was holding it on. Something was holding on the rest of the back. And if you look very closely, around each of the SDI inputs and actually around the DC input as well, there are these retaining nuts that are threaded around each BNC input. And they have, if you look very closely, corresponding grooves on either side of the nut, and that's meant for a tool to reach around the BNC input, grab those notches so you can unlock the nut. Unfortunately, I couldn't find the tool to do that, at least not very easily, and the ones that I did find were expensive, and they didn't seem to be a readily available tool. So I used a very thin set of needle nose pliers to take these nuts off with. And you have to be really careful because obviously Atomos probably puts them on with a specialized tool, and it had a good amount of torque on there. So I found it hard to get them off at first. But if you're just very careful, then you can use a very thin set of needle nose pliers just to release the tension. And this particular set, we look really closely there, I was able to get in here and grab both of those notches, and I was able to just spin that enough to release the tension. And then I just used a small flathead to get it the rest of the way off. And then you can see here, 2 things come off when you do that. You've got a very thin lock washer, and you've got the retaining nut. And if you look very carefully, the retaining nut, you can see those notches here are corresponding that are on opposite sides of the nut that are meant for that tool to grab. Again, I was able to use needle nose pliers. Just be careful when you're grabbing those that you don't accidentally damage either the bayonet pins that hold your SDI cables in or any part of the BNC connector. So just be mindful, but I was able to get all of them off. So you take all 6 of those off, and there's a very, very small retaining nut. Same thing, it's the same type, it's just smaller. If we can zoom in there around the DC input, it has those same notches. And again, I was able to use the needle nose pliers to grab those notches and spin. Again, be very careful. You've got more threads exposed on the DC input that you could damage if you're spinning a set of pliers around that. So technician be warned. Anyway, so you take all of those off, and then you can actually take the back of this thing off. But I was able to get all of those off, and I just kept all those pieces in a little container. So now it's basically detached, and all we have to do is gently pull up. You can see it's kind of separated here all along that seam. And there's only really one thing holding it onto itself, and that is actually, pull up really carefully, you can get it. So what's actually holding it on is the hard drive connection. The SATA hard drive connection goes from this port through the plastic to here and then connects right into right there. So that connection is kind of the only thing holding it after you get all the screws and the other nuts around the SDI inputs and outputs off. So you can take that off, and we are presented with this inside. And we can see here, we've got the Limo Mic XLR input there, and you can see that it's also just got a nut around the threads there holding it in place. And then you can see the audio cable ins and outs, which are connected to the little motherboard right there. So what actually happened was, you can see the wires that go from the Limo connector onto the motherboard right there. And I could tell right away what the problem was. When they put the back on at Atomos, the plastic from the back of the monitor obviously goes down, and what happened was 2 of these wires, which corresponded to the left inputs, got pinched between the metal little housing around this SDI or Genlock input. It got pinched between that piece of metal and the plastic from this that goes on. So basically, those 2 wires just got caught kind of in between. Where's a piece of wire? If this were the internal wire, the piece of wires just got caught in between a piece of plastic and a piece of metal, and it pinched them, and it actually ripped the coating on the wire, and the wires were exposed. So those 2 wires were then touching and causing everything to basically cancel each other out, because it was probably the pin 2 and pin 3, the hot and the cold signal, just canceled out, and I had no audio input into the Shogun on the left channel whatsoever. So let me see if I can actually show you a real tight close-up of these wires to show you exactly what happened. So right here you can actually see where it pinched, and you can see just a little bit of the wire poking through on the yellow cable there. And then also on the blue cable, you can see that the sheathing is a little pinched right there. And if you just move the sheathing a little bit, you can see that the wire is actually exposed. It's exposed in both the blue and the yellow because it got pinched basically between this point here, which is actually inside the Shogun. Once the plastic housing gets put back on, you can see once you put that on, that the part where it gets pinched is invisible to the eye because it's hidden behind the plastic housing. So those wires basically got pushed down, pinched right there, and because it pinched enough that the wires got exposed, the wires touched, canceled out the audio, and I had no audio on the left channel. So we are just going to fix that and then re-plug in our cables to the motherboard, and hopefully we'll have working audio. So to verify that that's actually the problem and that fixing those 2 wires from touching will solve our issues of not having any audio, I'm just going to take some electrical tape and a couple of small pieces, which I've already cut right here, and I'm just going to tape up the wires so that they aren't touching, they aren't conducting next to each other. and then we can put it back together real quick, test the Limo XLR connector, and see if we get working audio. So let's just tape over these two sections where the wire is exposed. So there's one with the yellow wire. So there, now with these two pieces of electrical tape covering the exposed parts of the wire, all we have to do is plug in these two connectors, just temporarily put the back on real quick, tape it so it doesn't come off, plug in our audio connector to the side, test the left input, test the right input, and if it's good, we know that that has solved our problem. Then we just actually need to fix the wires with something more than electrical tape. So let's do that. Just plug the white connector back in and plug the red connector back in. They're both plugged in. Carefully put the back on so that we're not pinching our cables. I'll line this up so you can see how this could happen very easily. So we just want to make sure the cables are plugged in tightly, and they will have to be folded down a bit so that the plastic housing, doesn't crush them. We want to make sure they don't get caught in between that SDI connection and the plastic housing again. So we'll just carefully put that on. All right. Assuming that we haven't pinched our cables again, we'll just put some gaff tape on this temporarily to hold the back on while we do our testing. Just enough to hold the front and back together. Good enough for testing. Hang on, let me get rid of this camera for a sec. We've got our Shogun temporarily put back together. We'll pop a battery in there, turn it on, grab our headphones because I want to hear this, not just see it on the audio meters. Plug in our headphones. We will take our audio input cable, plug that sucker in. For this, we're going to use just a microphone. I have the audio inputs set to expect microphone level in, so it will use its own preamp to boost the level of this SM58 up. Almost forgot. To be able to view the audio meters and actually hear any audio coming into the analog inputs, you have to have an active video signal going into the Shogun from something. We're just going to use my little Sony camera here to give it some sort of active video signal. So hang on, let me plug that in. There we go. And now, hopefully, the moment of truth. Let's open up the audio meters there. And we can hear audio on the right side. Good, we can see it in the meters right there. And now we'll plug in the left side and see if we have audio on the left. And awesome, we have audio on the left. We can also see it on the meters. So we know now that, I don't know why I'm talking to this microphone. So now we know that the cables being exposed inside, those two wires being pinched and the wires exposed, are what was causing the problem. So now we just need to go fix it. We'll power down and we'll go out to my garage to fix this thing. All right, so we've got a few things here. We obviously have our Atomos Shogun that is with the screws all out of it, ready to be taken apart. Got my multi-tool because it comes in very handy for stripping wires and cutting wires. Pair of scissors, doing the same thing. I've got some heat shrink because what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to cut those wires, solder them together, and then heat shrink over top of them. So therefore, we also have my soldering iron. It's a Weller model, and we have a heat gun for the heat shrink. Last but not least, safety glasses. Always, just wear them. So we will take the back off of our Shogun once again, put that aside. And now I just need to take the wiring out because I do not want to do the soldering over top of the motherboard in case I drop any solder. So to do that, we just take this retaining nut off of the Limo connector right there. Loosen it with a pair of needle nose pliers, spin that nut off. Disconnect from the motherboard again, of course. Then we can just slide these wires out of the retaining nut. And there's also a lock washer under there that helps hold that retaining nut in place. There's the retaining nut and the lock washer. We'll set those aside to put back on later, and we will put the back on our Shogun. Put that aside for now. All we really need to do is strip these wires, cut them, solder them together, and heat shrink them. So we'll just remove the electrical tape that we put on as a temporary hold. And again, we can see here our damaged yellow and blue wires. So we've got to cut these, which means we've got to be really good at knowing that we can repair them. And the reason I'm going to cut these is because once I cut them and solder them together, I need to cover up the wires with something. I have to do that with heat shrink tubing, but I can't get the heat shrink tubing on without slipping it on the end of the wire. I can't slip it on the end because of the connector that goes on the motherboard. So I've got to cut the wires in the middle and slip on some heat shrink tubing. And let's hope we're good enough to solder everything back together appropriately after we cut them. Here goes. 1 and 2. So now we'll just cut a couple of lengths of heat shrink tubing to prepare for later. You just strip back both pieces of wire. Now it's possible that I might have been able to remove these wires from the plastic connector, but that just seemed like it would mess things up, so I opted for the soldering option. And I'm not the best solderist, is that the right word, in the world, but I do well enough with what I have, and just takes a little bit of solder. Let's heat up our soldering iron. While that's heating up, we'll place our heat shrink tubing over the ends in preparation for covering up these solder joints. I'm going to attempt to use this little Weller solder station. See if it'll help me position these small wires in place. Just need to tin the wires a little bit just to get a little bit of solder on each end so that they'll go together more easily when we do the final solder. That's one end of each wire. We'll do the other ends. Line up the two blue wires. So all we really need to try to do is just heat that up. Let the solder stick to itself, and we're done without melting anything else like I almost did. That's the hard part. It's like operation. You got to get it at just the right angle. Be sure to keep your heat shrink away from your soldering iron. Mine got a little close and it shrunk the heat shrink a little too far up, and I had to cut it back a little so I could actually move it up the wire because it got stuck back here. So just be careful with your soldering iron. Slide your heat shrink up and over your solder joint. And I'm going to wait to shrink that until I've done the other soldering joint real quick. Let's do that one. All right, I'm happy with that. And I actually noticed there was a little bit more of a puncture wound further up, so I added a second piece of heat shrink so I could just cover most of that wire with 2 sets of heat shrink. All right, so we'll need to test this real quick before we have decided that I've done a good job on my soldering. So we'll run these wires back through because it's the only way we can really put the back on. Grab a battery, a little bit of gaff tape to hold together while we turn it over. Let's power it up. And again, we need that active video input so that we can actually test the audio. So we'll use my little Sony RX100 Mark II for that. All right, there we go. So we have video input. Now we need to test audio. Connect our connector. Grab some headphones, a microphone, and let's see what we get. Check 1, 2. All right, I have audio on my left. We can see it on the meters. It so far is very clean. I don't hear any sort of weird noises or buzzes or anything when I wiggle the cable. So let's try the right channel. And so far so good on the right channel. Clean audio, no clicks, buzzes, pops, hums, or anything like that. Let's turn it off, heat shrink our tubing, and do the final reassembly. We'll take our audio cables back out to do the heat shrinking. All right, heat gun is ready to go. Get everything else out of the way of where you're going to direct the heat. We don't want to melt anything that we don't want to melt. So you can see here that I actually had to add a little bit more heat shrink tubing to this. Hopefully it doesn't make it too stiff. It seems fairly pliable still and should be safe inside our Shogun. We'll do our last assembly and audio test and put it all back together. This time I will go ahead and put on the lock washer and the retaining nut. Tighten up that retaining nut. One last reconnection of our audio to the motherboard. We will make sure the cables don't get pinched this time as we put on the back. It's actually really hard to do, and my heat shrink tubing makes this yellow wire a little larger and more prone to getting pinched again, so we'll just have to be really careful. Try to just squeeze these over without damaging anything else. You can see that green one just wanting to get pinched there. I think I'm happy with that. Put the back on, I'll just try to watch it as it goes. Looks good to me. One more test before we put all the final screws in. Left, good, check, 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 check. Right, good, done. Let's put the screws in. There's the screws. We've got 4 in the corners. We've got 2 here. We've got 2 here. Now we just need to put on all of the lock washers and retaining nuts around the SDI inputs and all the rest of the BNC and Genlock inputs, and then the final one around the power input right there. And of course with these you want to make sure that these 2 notches are facing up so that you can actually grip them with some sort of tool and tighten them down. And again, since I don't have a specialized tool, I found this really thin set of needle nose pliers is what I was able to get them off with, so that's what we're going to put them back on with. So you've got this lock washer, and you need to make sure it actually goes all the way down in there before you try to put the retaining nut on. A little easier to do. The retaining nut gets closer to the threads where it needs to be threaded on. And you can get most of the tension around these nuts done with a very small flathead screwdriver, but you should definitely put some final tension on it with either the specialized tool or a good set of needle nose pliers. And I'm mostly able to turn it. A specialized tool would be easier, and you need to be really careful that when you're using needle nose pliers like this that you don't damage the bayonet pins or anything about the BNC connector as you're trying to turn that nut. So that's it. It's a fairly easy repair. The only thing that I really don't like and that takes some patience, as I said, is getting these retaining nuts off of the BNC connections. And there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them, plus a really small one around the AC input. 4 screws there, 2 screws there, 2 screws there, pops off. Bob's your uncle. And yeah, that's it. I hope this was helpful to at least show you how to take apart the Atomos Shogun 7 if you need to. And obviously one of the problems that came up with those crushed cables inside is it got reassembled at Atomos, unbeknownst to their repair tech. Anyway, thank you Atomos, thank you me, I guess, for figuring this out. And no thank you to the people that design these retaining nuts and don't make a tool readily available, or at least a cheap one, anyone that I could find to take those retaining nuts off. Anyway, till next time, see you later. Why did these go out of fashion? Dustbuster, it's great.